in theology, we've been looking at attributes of God. We looked at all kinds of different attributes, characteristics of God, things explaining. Tonight we'll look at one that's it's sort of hard for some to take. And this is the fact that God is a God of wrath. Oh, because that's some hard, because we talked about God being a God of love. And the fact we looked at this morning, I talked about Jesus full of grace and truth. But he's also God of wrath. Now some people think, well, how can you be loving and also filled with wrath? Well, as we study wrath in the Bible, it's the punishment that we all deserve. Okay? We all deserve the wrath of God. It's not just some people deserve the wrath of God. Everybody's under the curse of sin. So everybody, if justice was completely carried out, we'd all be under wrath. God has offered mercy and grace to those who accept the plan of salvation to escape that wrath. Okay, God loves us, and he wants to try to prevent us from experiencing wrath. Wrath, as we go to study here, let me give you some definition to understand it. God's wrath is his immediate and continuous response to man's wickedness. It is the settled opposition of his holiness to evil. God is holy, and so anything that's contrary to his holiness is subject to his wrath. Okay? It's subject to punishment. It's sin. It's wickedness. And so anything that's not according to his holiness is subject to punishment and wrath. Okay? God, he's a just God. We talked about his justice. And justice demands that sin, which is anything that is contrary to holiness, needs to be punished. Okay? And so if we all would receive justice, we would all experience the wrath of God. God has opened up an opportunity for mercy and grace. And until the door of mercy and grace is closed, that's there for us. Now we do know that one day the door of mercy and grace will be closed. And then there'll only be that wrath of God for those who reject God's mercy and grace. The Bible cites the wrath of God almost as much as he speaks about the love of God. For those who are not believers and those who like to, I think, attack the Bible, that's what they always harp on. Oh, how can you say God is a God of love and when he talks about the people going to hell? What is that? They can't understand those two things. See, they don't understand that everybody should be bound to hell. I mean, if God was just because of our sin, that's it. God's mercy and grace is offered to keep us from there. But he's not going to do away with the punishment because that would make him unjust. Now we look at this as there's one place where we see the love of God and the wrath of God sort of reconciled together. And I think some of you know what I'm talking about. Where's that at? Joseph? The cross. Yeah. The cross is where we see the love of God poured out and we see the wrath of God poured out. The wrath of God was, there's such that when I preached here again in Isaiah 53 here a few weeks ago, where I think it's such a great verse of the Bible there in Isaiah 53 talks about where God was satisfied with the sacrifice. I think that's one of the key verses of all the Bible about salvation and what it takes for God to be pleased with. He was satisfied with the sacrifice of Christ. And so at the cross, God was punishing his son Jesus for all the sins of the world. And so there he was taking all the wrath so that he could extend mercy and grace to those who accept that sacrifice. And so the cross was the wrath of God. Of course, it was the love of God. I mean, he laid his life down for us, for lost sinners. So we see that how that's sort of reconciled together. And we can see then how that is such a beautiful picture. God is said to be angry at wickedness 180 times in the Old Testament. So over and over again, God's angry at wickedness. Sometimes the word is used, and God is said to be hot with anger. Hot with anger. He just, sometimes we don't understand why sin goes so much against the nature of God. In our society, in our world, we've got used to sinfulness to the point it doesn't nauseate us. It takes, in fact, we have to have a bunch of wicked things to happen to get us sick of sin, doesn't it? I mean, it takes somebody going in and killing 20 kids or something for us to go, oh, that's nauseating. That's terrible, and it is. But God is so sensitive to sin, he's nauseated at one lie, isn't he? At one act of immorality. See, we don't understand that the nature of God and his holiness to that point. So, because we have to have we're so used to the sinfulness. It's like maybe we could, if we have like a real dirty house, and somebody walks in with dirty shoes, it doesn't really bother you. But if you've got a beautiful house with white carpet, and the neighbor kid walks in with his muddy shoes, you go, oh! That's like God. God he's white in holiness. And every sin before him is dirt. You get that picture? And it angers him because of the rebellion it is. See, sin's a rebellion. Whether it's a little sin or what we consider a little sin or something really bad, it's all rebellion. It's all us putting ourselves above his will and his way. So because of the wrath of God is demonstrated throughout Scripture and explained to us. And in fact, in one of the verses, in fact, John 3:36, someone, let's read that there to me, someone. Because in John 3, it has the great passage of the love of God. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. What's John 3:36 say?
He that believeth for the Son hath everlasting life, and he that believeth not the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abideth on him.
But the wrath of God, for who? Who doesn't believe, right. So it's anybody who doesn't believe. It's not a group, this is not one little particular group of people, it's not a certain race of people, it's those who believe not. So in John chapter 3, you see the love of God taught and the wrath of God taught. They go hand in hand. You can escape the wrath of God through his love and mercy by accepting his Son. That escapes you from the wrath of God. Now in the Bible there's a lot of places, there's a whole bunch of things here, but you see in the wrath of God, there's objects of God's wrath, and we see sometimes it's upon Israel. I'll just read this one verse here. Even Israel was God's chosen nation. We've been looking at that in our study with Abraham. Look at what it says there in Ezekiel about the nation of Israel. Yea, I will gather you and blow upon you in the fire of my wrath. And ye shall be melted in the midst thereof. As silver is melted in the midst of the furnace, so shall you be melted in the midst thereof. And ye know that I am the Lord, have poured out my fury upon you. And so God says, even to his nation, if they're unrepentant, my wrath will come upon you. And of course, as we study in the Old Testament, you see the nation of Israel being that example of disobedience, because God told about bless you if you do certain things, but if you don't do certain things, you're going to experience the wrath, chastening, and God brought his wrath upon him by using foreign countries like the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians, and we see that over and over again throughout the Bible. And if they continue to reject Christ in the future, the Messiah, they'll suffer that wrath. The nation will receive someday in the future, those who receive the Messiah will receive his grace and mercy. But those who don't are going to be subject to his wrath, even the children of Israel. It's only through the person of Christ can they experience, get away from that wrath also. And I'm not going to look at all. There's different reasons. Idolatry. You know, if you got page 466 in your book, there's different things. The reason he was bring his wrath. Idolatry. That was putting other things above God. That was a big problem with them over the years and centuries of their third for slanderous complaining. You know, the murmuring and all that stuff. Just plain out disobedience to the things of God, mocking his prophets. Intermarriage with pagan women, they wasn't supposed to do that. This general unbelief. So all of these different things was some of the reasons that God at times poured his wrath out. And throughout the scriptures we see all kinds of others who are subject to the wrath of God. You know, God doesn't play favorites. Sometimes Moses experienced the wrath of God. In fact, Moses in his sin was not able to go into the land of promise. So, you know, God doesn't show partiality. We saw it after they moved inland with Achan. Achan was under Joshua's command, and he stole what he wasn't just stole. And God, if you know the story of Achan, he was pretty harsh on Achan and his family, wasn't he? And he was very harsh. King Saul received the punishment and wrath of God. And down everybody too who rejects Christ eventually will receive the wrath of God. Now let's just look at some demonstrations of God's wrath. We look down through here. The universal flood, of course, is one of the big pictures of the wrath of God in the book of Genesis we studied. God's wrath he was so angry at the world for their evil and wickedness, he destroyed them all but 8 souls. We see Calvary. We mentioned that. That's where the wrath of God is poured out. Let's read a couple verses here. 2 Corinthians 5:21 is an important verse of the Bible. 2 Corinthians 5:21. Someone read that to me.
For he hath made him to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that he might be made the righteousness of God in him.
For he made him to be sin for us. Now that means that he had to be punished for sin. Okay, the only one that never committed sin had to be directly punished by God for sin, in order us who did sin could escape the judgment of sin. And then someone else read 1 Peter 3:18. 1 Peter 3:18. Someone have that for me?
Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit.
Yeah, he suffered for sins. He was punished for sins, okay? So Christ was the object of the wrath of God. There's other demonstrations of God's wrath would be, of course, the coming great tribulation. There's a lot of verses of that. We looked at that in the study of Revelation, of course. Oh man, that's the wrath of God described upon this world yet to come more than any time in the history of mankind. And that's yet to come, isn't it? What the flood was to Noah's day, well, the great tribulation would be devastating in the future world too. Much of the earth would be destroyed during that time. The very end at Armageddon, when God puts down the final battle and revolt there at the time of the great white throne judgment, is the final place for the wrath of God. In Revelation chapter number, it's actually in chapter 20 there. Great white throne judgment, where all those of humanity from every age who just rejected God in the revelation that he gave to them will stand before him and give an answer and accountability for their sin. They're to be cast into the lake of fire for all of eternity. That's what the Bible teaches about rejection of the Lord. That's the wrath of God. You know, people don't like to hear about the wrath of God. I know they like to hear about the love of God, and those are nice things. I mean, who doesn't want to hear about the love of God? But the wrath of God it makes the love of God even more important. When you understand we've all deserved that wrath. It's not just a few people out there deserve that wrath. I deserve that wrath. You deserve that wrath. So that makes the love of God a lot better and stronger. How strong would the love be if there would be nothing that we really saved from? The love of God is magnified because of the wrath of God. And then a couple verses here, the protection from God's wrath is, somebody read Romans 5:9 to me there. Great verse in Romans.
Much more then, being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from his wrath.
Much more then, read that next part again.
Being now justified by his blood.
Being justified by his blood, we shall be saved. Just declared righteous who? By the blood. Through the blood of the cross, of the sacrifice of Christ, through his punishment, his suffering. And then also another great verse is 1 Thessalonians 1:10. Someone, 1 Thessalonians 1:10. You want to have that to me? Just read it.
To wait for his Son from heaven, whom he hath raised from the dead, even Jesus, which delivered us from the wrath to come.
Delivered us from the wrath to come. That future wrath of God upon unrepentant rejectors of Christ. So we understand from the Bible that God's a lot of things. He's merciful, just, and holy, and loving, and compassionate. We looked at so many of these things. But he's also a God of wrath. And his wrath is based upon his justice. It's not based, as I said before, it's not based upon God just throwing a temper tantrum. That's what we do. We throw temper tantrums when we don't get our way. It's based upon his holiness and his justice. That every single soul born in this world is subject to and will receive without the mercy, without God's grace applied to their life. And that's the reason I believe that everybody is included in the opportunity for salvation. You can reject it or receive it, but you got that opportunity to know God and be free and delivered from the wrath of God. So I hope we understand that part about God. It's a very important part about his nature, and it's not to be looked over because we don't like to talk about it. I think God would not be real pleased with that. He wants us to know who he is and why he's that way and what he's done to protect us from that wrath to come. Okay.